Today we will learn and reflect on the teachings of the Church Fathers on the 10th commandment. Do not covet and do not envy. Although coveting is a sinful thought, it is still a very serious sin, as coveting can lead to all the other sins, including murder, theft, and adultery. Just as the first psalm is a progression, so the Decalogue is a progression. The first psalm goes from walking to standing to sitting, as we read, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night." Likewise, for the Decalogue, if we think pure thoughts, then our speech will be pure. If we speak encouraging and loving words, then our actions will be pure. But our actions will not be pure unless our thoughts and words are pure. At the end of our talk, we will discuss the sources we use for this video and my blogs that cover this topic. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. In Luke, Jesus told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. Two men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and one a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, "God, I thank thee that I'm not like these other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector over here. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all I get." But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. We imagine that we're the tax collector. Perhaps we even thank God that we're not like the Pharisee over there. But if we go to church on Sunday and live a cutthroat life on Monday, taking advantage of those around us, not loving our neighbor, then we are the Pharisee. Perhaps this is the best way to learn from this paragraph, to see ourselves as Pharisees, so we too can repent like the tax collector. Now ask any waitress. The best tippers are the drunks who come in from the bars on weekend nights. But the worst tippers, they are the least generous, are the Christians coming in for their Sunday brunch after church. So since we really do not know how to love our neighbor, perhaps it would be better for us in the modern world to start with the last commandment and go to the first. For like we hear in the country song, if we don't love our neighbor, we can never love God. Before we study this section in the Catechism, in this blog, we're going to our favorite summary of the 10 Commandments is that provided by St. Gregory Palamas in Volume 4 of the Philokalia, so that's where we'll start. St. Gregory Palamas teaches us the command not to covet is not only a negative "thou shalt not" command, but is more a "thou shalt" positive command, that we should be generous and show charity and lend to our less fortunate neighbor, and to watch after our neighbor's interests, returning to him lost items that you may find. And St. Gregory Palamas says this, "Covetousness conceived in the soul produces sin, and sin, when committed, results in death, as James says. Refrain from coveting what belongs to others and avoid filching things out of greediness. Rather, you should give from what you possess to whomever asks of you, and you should, as much as you can, be charitable to whoever is in need of charity. And you should not refuse whoever wants to borrow from you. Should you find some lost article, you should keep it for its owner, even if the owner is hostile towards you. Perhaps your kindness will change him, and your kindness will overcome evil, as Christ commands." Does this last of the command simply admonish, "You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or anything that belongs to your neighbor"? No, this is far too important a commandment than that. It first lists all that's important to your neighbor that you should not covet, and then says you should not covet any of your neighbor's other possessions. If you love your neighbor as yourself, you will want the best for your neighbor. You will not be angry if he is something that you do not. If your neighbor is more fortunate than you, if your neighbor is wealthier than you, rather you will rejoice in your neighbor's good fortune. Envy and covetousness is a dangerous sin. It leads to all the other sins. Before you steal, before you adulter, before you murder, before you covet, you envy. Envy is the enemy of friendship. Envy is a sin of your thoughts that leads to a sin of your words, and ultimately leads to sins of commission, the sins of orneriness, theft, adultery, and murder. The best example of how envy and covetousness can lead to other sins is how King David coveted the wife of Uriah the Hittite, and how this envy and covetousness quickly led to many other sins. And we read in 2 Samuel 11, "In the spring of the year, the time when kings go forth to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they ravaged their enemies. But David remained at Jerusalem," for the first time, I might add. "And it happened late one afternoon, when David arose from his couch and was walking upon the roof of the king's house. And he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful." Now you might ask, how much of a coincidence was it that Bathsheba chose to bathe at this very time when David was marching across his roof? So David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she was purifying herself from uncleanness. Then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, "I am with child." Immediately the envy and covetousness David felt for the wife of Uriah the Hittite had led to adultery and pregnancy. David then lied, trying to trick Uriah into spending time with his wife when he was called back from the front by David, but Uriah refused. Maybe he was onto this. David then instructed his general Joab to place Uriah near the front of the army so he would be killed, adding murder to his crimes, and theft, since then he married Bathsheba. Notice how scriptures note that Bathsheba was the daughter of Eliam, whom he dishonored, which adds another sin. And most of all, this was a sin against God. The Exodus version of the 10th commandment admonishes us. And here we see how it details all of the things that you shouldn't covet. "You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox, or donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor." An interesting observation by Von Rad in his commentary on Deuteronomy is that the Hebrew word for covet has a double meaning. It can be translated as coveting or as taking. One possible implication is that because coveting itself is a sin, then spiritually coveting is a type of spiritual theft, as we imagine a future day when that which is our neighbor's belongings now belongs to us. The initial envious temptation may not be a sin, but it develops into coveting when we feed the initial desire by our evil imaginings. Just as God heard the cry of blood and the ground drained from Abel's murder, so God heard the cry of anger in Cain's heart as he pondered the evil deed. The wrestling against sin begins in our heart as we wrestle with the temptation that seeks to grow into covetousness. St. John Climacus, in his monastic handbook, The Ladder of Divine Ascent, guards his monks from envy by having them give up their possessions. Non-possessiveness is the resignation of care, life without anxiety, an unencumbered wayfarer, alienation from sorrow, fidelity of the commandments. As envy is the gateway to all the other sins against your neighbor, so envy often precedes theft, adultery, anger, and murder. So, non-possessiveness leads us to fidelity to the commandments, enabling us to love our neighbor and our God. And St. John Climacus tells us, "He who despises what is material is rid of quarrels and controversies, but the covetous man will fight to the death for a needle." And St. John Climacus continues, "Timothy tells us that the love of money is the root of all evil, because it produces hatred, thefts, envy, separations, enmities, storms, remembrance of wrongs, hard-heartedness, and murders. Job showed no trace of avarice when he lost everything. He remained undisturbed. When you cling to your possessions, do you own them or do they own you? Were a hurricane to strike and sweep away all you own in the wind and the water and the waves, would you lose everything? Waves never leave the sea, nor do anger and grief leave the avaricious." And as you see, we have a series of lectures on the Ladder of Divine Ascent as well. Now we'll look at some of the teachings from the Philokalia on envy. St. Maximus the Confessor links self-esteem to avarice. For those who are full of self-esteem acquire riches, and those who are rich become full of self-esteem. Likewise, he links rancor and resentment to envy. It is hard to check the resentment of an envious person, for what he envies in you, he considers his own misfortune. You cannot check his envy except by hiding from him the things that arouse his passion. Now, how can you defeat your own enemy? Simply by rejoicing with the man whom you envy whenever he rejoices, and grieving whenever he grieves, fulfilling St. Paul's words. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. St. Palacios teaches us that pride and boastfulness are characterized by hypocrisy, guile, trickery, pretense, and worst of all, deceit. These are aided and abetted by envy, strife, anger, resentment, and rancor. Such is the state of those who live dissolutely, and such are the treasures hidden in my heart. The three most common forms of desire, which are gluttony, self-esteem, and avarice, have their origin in the passion of self-love. From these base desires flow resentment, anger, rancor, envy, and listlessness. Preacher Dwight Moody sees envy as the creeping sin, the sin few confess, the sin few notice as it creeps into their soul, the sin of the mind and the heart that leads us to other sins. Covetousness and stealing are Siamese twins, and when you add lying, they are triplets. Covetousness destroys faith and spirituality, turning man's minds and hearts away from God. Nations go to war when they covet riches and territory. The scriptures squeeze the covetousness between thieves and drunkards. Envy is what led Eve, then Adam, to the first sin. They were not satisfied with what God had showered upon them, but coveted the wisdom of the gods, which Satan deceitfully told them might be obtained by eating the fruit. In their book on the Ten Commandments, Dr. Laura and her rabbi say that in the Hebrew, in Deuteronomy, two words are used. We are forbidden to covet our neighbor's wife, while we are forbidden to desire our neighbor's house. And some scholars see desiring as leading to coveting. Coveting is a sin of our thoughts. Proverbs exhorts us that among the 6 things the Lord hates is a heart that devises wicked plans. Likewise, Leviticus exhorts us, you shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason with your neighbor, lest you bear sin because of him. As Dr. Laura and her rabbi put it, coveting involves wanting something at someone else's expense, not just simply wanting something. And now we'll discuss the sources we used for this video. We quoted several Eastern Church Fathers from several volumes of the Philokalia that are not referenced in the Catholic Catechism, and the Catechism also referenced several works from St. Augustine and a work from St. Gregory of Nyssa on the Beatitudes, and these works from St. Augustine and St. Gregory of Nyssa on the Last Commandment will have blogs and videos of their own. We also quoted from the Ladder of Divine Ascent. We'll be recording videos and blogs as we climb the rungs of the ladder in the coming years on this ladder. Dwight Moody has some excellent sermons on the Decalogue, and the book by Dr. Laura and her rabbi is excellent. She recounts many interesting stories from the calls she has fielded on her show over the years, and her rabbi provides interesting commentary. And we provide you the web link to access the Catholic Catechism online if you wish. The YouTube description links to the video script and our blog. Please support our channel by sharing this video with your friends, and by clicking the like and subscribe buttons, and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. And please click on the links for interesting videos and other topics that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul. Thank you.